You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Family Lawyer podcast. Today I'm chatting about the impact of drug and alcohol testing on the courts, what we need to be thinking about, what as practitioners we need to be doing in terms of our instructions to firms, and how we can present that to the courts as well. Joining me to discuss this and provide some insight and expertise is Donna Muldoon, Reporter Manager at Lextox. It's great to have you on the podcast. Donna, thanks for joining.
Thank you very much for inviting me, David.
Hopefully I've done the conversation justification in the introduction, but in the first instance, it'd be really useful if you wouldn't mind telling me a little bit about yourself and your role at Lextox, please.
I'm Donna Muldoon. I have a Bachelor of Science degree with honours in forensic science. I discovered, I think many moons ago, that forensic science really did interest me. Oddly enough, whilst watching the O.J. Simpson trial back in the day, that was broadcast live. And it just amazed me really just how powerful science could be in the court of law, the importance of presenting evidence correctly, and also what science sort of can and can't show in the law courts. So my first job after graduating, I worked in a bulk drugs lab. So that was where I tested the drugs themselves after they were seized. And then in 2008, I moved into the field of hair testing, where I specialised in the examination of hair samples. And 15 years later, I'm still working within this field. So I currently work for Lextox, which is a member of SynLab. So Lextox is an ISO 17025 UCAS accredited laboratory, and we were formed in 2011. So as part of my role, I review the analytical data obtained from the laboratory. I interpret the results obtained from the testing. I issue expert reports for court, and I also provide oral evidence at court as well.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. A really helpful introduction and a really useful introduction into the topic of conversation today, which, as I say, is around alcohol and drug testing and its role in family proceedings. I guess my first question to you is when and where are you most likely to be called upon to provide support for family lawyers? I feel very naive when I talk to the drug and alcohol testing companies, because I sort of sit here and think to myself, well, it can't be that often, can it?
Sadly, it is. It's very widely used in family courts. The lab itself, we are based in the beautiful city of Cardiff. However, we do testing across the whole of the UK. We can offer support really at any point during your case. However, we do strongly recommend doing the testing as early on in the process as possible. Ideally, this would be at pre-proceeding stage, at that very early fact-finding stage, when not a lot really is known about a case, is where really you'd want that full insight as to what may be the critical areas for you to focus on, or may not. So we always recommend testing really is done right at the very early pre-proceeding stage, and so that there are no delays to court proceedings.
This might seem like a bit of a daft question, but what are we trying to establish when we're doing the testing? I mean, for example, is it an existential question to say that, well, this person abuses alcohol or abuses drugs and therefore is a bad parent, and ergo, the child should be taken off them? What are we trying to prove through the use of drug and alcohol testing?
So firstly, absolutely not. We're not here to decide whether, a person is a good or a bad parent. Luckily, those decisions don't lie with us. We simply offer the guidance to the courts and yourselves on avenues that may potentially be areas that you need to investigate. For example, donors can be quite open and honest during these proceedings. Conversely, you can get donors that don't wish to provide the evidence. So it really does provide a really solid insight as to what considerations may be involved with each case, really.
I know, and this is a topic that we've talked about through other podcasts and also through the today's Family Lawyer publication, that a lot of practitioners will instruct a test without, and perhaps we mean this with the greatest of respect, without fully understanding what that involves. Can you talk us through that process and how it works?
The initial part following the instruction is the sample collection. So the collection itself can be done by a professional such as yourselves. So we will provide written instructions, but the preferred method is to use one of our fully trained collectors because the results do end up in court. So it's absolutely critical that that first stage of the process, the collection, is undertaken correctly, and also that the correct amount of hair is taken, because we have seen some scary samples come into the lab that have been collected not by one of our collectors. So yeah, the collection really is a critical stage of the process. At the collection, we will obtain all the necessary information on things that can actually impact results. And we will also importantly make sure that we identify the person correctly, because we have had instances in the past, and it's not unheard of, that people will actually send other persons on their behalf, shall we say, to said collections. So it's really important that we do get that identification up front. Hair is a really stable matrix, actually, so it doesn't have any storage or transportation considerations. So once the hair sample is collected and packaged up in tamper evident chain of custody evidence bags, they're usually sent via Royal Mail Track 24 or Secure DX to our laboratory. So the very first thing that we do upon receipt is we will check all of those chain of custody integrities, make sure that the sample is sealed and that we are happy to proceed. And on that occasion, then the testing can commence. So we will take a photograph of the hair, and we'll also undertake a visual assessment where we look for any visual sort of dye lines or any impacts that can affect the testing. And the photograph then of the hair is stored. So the hair is cut then into smaller sections, depending on case requirements. And each one of those sections is very importantly washed prior to analysis. So the washing stage is really important because it will remove anything that may be present on the outside of the hair. After we've washed the hair, the next stage of the process is to actually extract the drugs or alcohol markers from the hair. So this process essentially pulls anything out, because hair is quite a stable matrix and it's got a strong barrier. So whilst drugs are, it's hard to incorporate into hair, it's also hard to pull them out. So we will extract anything from the hair shaft then itself. So once the compounds are removed, we will clean up that sample and remove anything that isn't important, and that's called the solid phase extraction. And that process, we are just collecting the compounds of interest. We will then dry down that solution, and we will add further solutions to prepare it then ready to be analysed on our instrumentation. There are many steps involved really during the life cycle of the hair testing.
As you're chatting, Donna, I've got visions of those CSI television programs from the 90s and the noughties when they're all in the lab looking at the samples. I suspect it's probably not quite as glamorous as it was made out in those programs. One question comes to mind as you're talking through that. You talk about splitting the hair into sections. I'm a layperson when it comes to this, but is there an issue where any drug or alcohol is going to appear in a particular section of the hair as it's grown?
Yeah, so I guess you can think of hair testing really as almost like a little tape recorder. So a lot of people will use that analogy. Everyone's hair does grow at slightly different rates, but generally, our hair grows at about 1 centimetre per month. As our hair grows, it's supplied via a follicle under the skin. That follicle has the blood supply. So ultimately, whatever is present in your blood at a given time, as the hair grows, it becomes trapped essentially within the hair, which is why you can cut then the hair samples into smaller sections to give it a pattern or a history of somebody's drug use or alcohol consumption.
You talked about the factors on collection that could impact the quality of the sample. I mean, presumably there are any number of environmental factors that could impact it, and not least, I don't know what kind of shampoo you use or how often you wash your hair, something along those lines.
So generally, normal hygiene practices such as shampooing, and we all shampoo our hair, generally they don't affect hair testing. Hair, it really is a strong barrier. So normal hygiene practices, including washing, brushing your hair, even having your hair cut, all won't affect hair testing.
And going back to CSI and film and television, some of those programs would have you believe that there are ways that you can mask alcohol and drug consumption in some way, whether it's through a secondary drug or a cleansing shampoo of some description. Again, is that possible?
So yeah, I'm aware that there are essentially they're marketed on the internet as toxin removal shampoos. They're often sold at quite hefty prices, but we have undertaken studies on those because they are important within the industry. And when we undertook the testing, what we found was generally those or products sold as toxin removal shampoos or they'll help you pass your drugs test don't actually remove the drugs at all from the hair. So whilst there are products that claim to do that out there, the ones that we've tested don't actually work.
What other environmental factors are there that can impact the results?
A very obvious point, but quite an important one is hair is actually on the outside of the body, so as such is subject to external factors. So an example of that would be if someone is smoking a drug, for example cannabis, then the smoke itself does actually come into contact with the hair, and the drugs themselves can come into contact with hair. So we do recognize this as a potential challenge for hair testing. However, we have the robust measures in place to minimize, if not eliminate that. One of the things is using recognized cutoff levels to determine use. Very importantly, I've touched upon, we do wash all our hair samples prior to analysis, and that's just to essentially remove anything that may be present on the outside of the hair. And then we also look for metabolites as well. So these are formed in the body when drugs themselves are used.
Another area that I know that is a popular area for testing is nails. Now, again, my very limited understanding of science is that hair and nails are actually quite similar, aren't they, in their makeup?
That's correct. So they're both made up of keratin. Hair is a lot softer, and nails is made exactly of the same, but it's just a much harder form of keratin.
And so you can test nails in the same way that you can test hair?
Absolutely. So if a donor doesn't have sufficient hair, we can test body hair, but nail testing is an alternative. Nail testing, whilst it's been around for many years, it's still in its infancy, really. And the scientific studies and literature out there is not to the depth that hair testing is, but it can be, tested more or less in the same way. The main difference between hair and nails is that whilst it can go back historically, you can't sort of break down nail testing, so you can't show patterns of use. It's almost like a backup if there's no hair, just to give an indication of whether a donor has consumed alcohol or used any drugs.
So I kind of wanted then to talk about what impacts results. How can we be sure that the story that you're telling through that hair sample is the truth? And equally, again, as we've kind of touched on in other podcasts, I know that, for example, there are other environmental factors that can impact those results as well. So how can we be sure that the science is telling us what we think it is?
I touched upon hair testing, and there are many stages involved in hair testing, from the berry collection all the way through the lab. So at every stage there are checks in place to ensure that the results are correct and legally defensible. So we've touched upon, hair isn't black and white, and there are, the results obtained, there are factors to consider, very important factors as well, when interpreting these results. So I can touch upon a couple of those. And the first one really is the way in which hair grows. It would be nice and easy if someone uses drugs, they test positive, you stop, you test negative. But there is a consideration just simply due to the way in which hair grows, where it is possible for an individual to give rise to a positive result for a few months after they've actually stopped using a drug. Our hair grows in cycles. So just very simply, it will grow for a period of many years, which is why we can, some of us can grow hair quite long. Then the hair will sort of stop and it almost rests and sits on the head for a couple of months before it eventually falls out. Now, luckily for us, that is normal. We all shed hair in the shower when we brush our hairs, and every hair grows independently of each other. So in other words, those stages don't happen all at once. If they did, what we'd find is our hair would grow, and every couple of years, all of our hairs would fall out, we'd go bald, and off it goes. So it's because of this resting phase that can actually give rise and, let someone have a positive result even when they stopped. Now, because of the growth rate, it does produce a very characteristic pattern. So again, if we believe that is due to someone stopping a few months prior, then we will absolutely let the courts know that.
And I think the other thing that I've taken away from the conversation that I've had with yourself in preparation for this podcast, Donna, is that the results aren't the be all and end all. Again, go back to what we said at the start of the podcast about what the science tells us. We have to be careful sometimes, for the very reason that you've outlined, that we're not biased in some way by the results of a drug and alcohol test in a negative way.
We don't know the circumstances of an individual, and rightly so. If somebody is using drugs and alcohol, I think the importance is, establishing that, and then it's looking at other forms of testing then and other forms of evidence in regards to, psychological reports, doctors' reports, just to piece all of that together to determine really ultimately whether the environments are safe or not. Drug testing really is just a piece of that jigsaw and should help formulate those decisions.
We started out the discussion by talking about some of the practicalities of the process, which I hope is quite insightful for listeners. I wondered, Donna, if you could just tell me about what your process is from the point of view of supporting the family lawyer. We've talked about the fact that the reports may not be the silver bullet, for example. How are we helping family lawyers, one, to understand and interpret the results, and two, just through that journey of working with a drug and alcohol testing service?
So we've just touched upon that there are many, many aspects that you all deal with in cases. So, you certainly don't deal with drug testing all day, every day, whereas we do. We've got dedicated client managers here. I guess it can be quite scary sometimes when a judge orders drug testing and you may not be actually familiar with, what these drugs are, what hair testing can and can't show. Firstly, the first point of contact would be the dedicated client managers. And the easiest way to get in touch with us then is simply a quick call. We have actually had, lawyers call us from court directly after the judge has just ordered the testing. So we can talk through those case requirements and ultimately be able to support and guide you on what the best course of action is.
And what's actually in a report, and how can that be kind of used as part of the process? What's the comeback that the other side is kind of going to look at and challenge?
The expert reports will ultimately cover everything. So from start to finish, we will detail the information of the chain of custody, which is ever so important because, the results need to be legally defensible. We also obtain information from the donor at the time of collection around chemical hair treatments and products that can impact on the results. So we will detail all of that in our reports, and also how that will affect the results obtained. Importantly, and obviously, they do contain the results themselves, and we will then interpret those results. So we will look at the patterns, we will look at all the factors of that particular case, and we will interpret the results and give the interpretation of what they mean, essentially, to the court of law. We will also put it back to the donor's declaration as well, whether we believe that that's consistent with what they're saying or not consistent.
I think I'm quite naive to some of the challenges that you face on a daily basis, and some of the challenges that family lawyers face on a daily basis as well. What's painfully obvious from the conversations that I have around this is that we've got to be better as a family community in understanding what we're looking for through these sorts of tests, and two, what the implications on the case are really. And as we've said, they're not a silver bullet. They are to be used as part of the full gamut of information in a case, and there seems to be some progress on that in terms of just getting people to understand that, yeah, there is the science there, but science sometimes are different shades of grey rather than black and white, which is not the way the courts work, of course.
And I think that comes with the time and understanding. We can support with that.
Donna, it's been fantastic to have you on the podcast to share your insight and share some of that understanding of the process as well. So thank you very much indeed for joining.
Thank you very much for having me.
The Today's Family Lawyer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk. My thanks to Donna. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.